Hello everyone and welcome to our Nokia D-Field live stream. The topic of today's session is the rise of botnet DDoS. We will explore the rise of the distributed denial of service and what can we do about it. If you have any questions, feel free to enter them in the chat box on the side. We will do our best to answer them. I'm joined today by my two colleagues, experts in this topic, Dr. Craig Labovitz, who is the CTO of Nokia D-Field and has been a veteran in this industry. So Craig has spent more than 25 years looking at internet traffic patterns and in particular looking at the DDoS security. We're also joined by my other colleague, Jérôme Mayer, who is leading the business development for the Asia Pacific region. Jérôme, in his previous roles and in his current role, has been dealing a lot with service providers worldwide, both mobile and fixed. And in his current role, he's exclusively focused on the Asia Pacific region. My name is Alex Pavlovich. I'm the Product Marketing Director in Nokia D-Field. I hope you will enjoy this session. So let's start with Craig to hit it off. So Craig, we've recently published our DDoS in 2021 report, and one of the major findings of that report was the rise of botnet DDoS. So can you give us a little bit of introduction? What is botnet DDoS? What type of devices are used in these botnets? How widely this problem is spread? And give us some quantification of the problem, please.
Yeah, sure. So, of course, as you said in your introduction, many of us have been working on DDoS since, the earliest days of the internet. So certainly DDoS is not new. And certainly we've seen botnets and compromised computers for much of certainly the last decade. But what really has changed is perhaps two things. One of them is that we've been working, as well as many others in the security community, with providers and hosting and data centers around the world to try to attack the problem of other types of DDoS. These were the traditional amplification and spoofing from data centers, people faking traffic. So over the last 5 years, we've made significant inroads in preventing and stopping many of what had been the majority of DDoS. This is both through better security controls, better providers understanding what their customers are doing and doing best common practices. So one of the results of the significant inroads we've made on adding additional layers of security and filtering and other controls is that certain types of DDoS have declined, particularly amplification and some of the spoofing attacks we've seen over the last year and accelerating over the last 6 months. Of course, when you attack one type of DDoS, others emerge. And certainly given the level of money and just the size of the ecosystem, we've seen a significant increase in the number of botnet-based attacks. And by botnet-based attacks, I particularly mean not necessarily compromised computers, though there are a lot of cloud servers that are compromised, but particularly it is the sheer number of IoT type devices, ranging from thermostats to webcams to, as I think we'll discuss later, even parking meters, all internet connected, all compromised, and now all being used in ever larger DDoS attacks. And as we'll discuss later, it really is just the sheer number of these devices as IoT expands significantly, and it's really the significant bandwidth that many of these have. The problem, of course, is not just that the bots are attacking victims, but for many of our customers, it is sheer number of bots in their own network that are attacking other networks in the internet that are starting to cause congestion and other types of quality of experience issues. So very marked increase, certainly over the last 6 months, and we are particularly sensitive to just the sheer number of devices that are being compromised and leveraged on a daily basis.
Are these new devices or devices that we haven't seen before? Are they repeatedly used in these attacks? Can you give us some idea of the attacks as they happen on a daily basis? How many of them are there? Is it in the hundreds, thousands, or millions? What is the range of these dangerous attacks?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So there are various estimates, and we of course have our own, but they're certainly in the hundreds of thousands of compromised devices that are actively participating. Though as we look at attacks on a daily basis, there seem to be in the range of 50,000, 60,000 to 100,000 that are used in commercial DDoS activity and sort of are the workhorse. That is, we see the same 60, 70,000 used again and again on a daily basis, used all day, every day in different campaigns, from attacking banks to attacking game players to attacking other types of critical infrastructure. So it doesn't appear to be in the millions, or there indeed may be a million or more compromised PCs, but really we're in the range of 100,000 or so that seem to be used on a constant daily basis as part of organized attacks.
Thank you. Let's switch to Jerome now. Hi, Jerome. So you're closer to the customers, and in particular to customers in the Asia Pacific region. Can you tell us a little bit more about what effects does DDoS have on customer networks, and in particular botnet DDoS? What are the major implications for having these devices in the network, and what are the repercussions for service providers?
Sure, Alex. So I think today most service providers continue to need protecting their own infrastructure and also for the most part their enterprise customers in particular. What is changing, however, I think, as Craig mentioned, is that some of those attacks, especially when they are botnet-based, can be more challenging to detect as they no longer rely on that spoofed IP traffic. And they can also be extremely large, and we've seen multiple examples of multi-terabit attacks that involve just a couple of thousands of bots. So it can take a lot of, it can have a definite impact on a particular service providers if they are the target of the attack. What we've seen also emerge a bit more recently in some service providers, and especially to some of we've been talking to here in Asia, is to understand a bit better the behaviors and the impact of those bots in their network, because some of those are starting to realize that this can have some very practical implications when especially your international connectivity is limited to begin with. So there can be a lot of outbound DDoS traffic that essentially wastes a non-trivial portion of your upstream bandwidth, right? So the key thing to start with in those cases, and this is really starting to pop up in some countries around here, is first to see, what visibility can we get on those bots that are generating this type of DDoS traffic. And in most cases, so far when we start those discussions, even very large service providers don't know exactly where those bots are, what type of profile they have, what characteristics they have. And when we look a little bit more closely, as we have in the past year, for example, Craig mentioned parking meters. We are seeing tons of DVR, so digital video recorders, that are generating a ton of traffic that use some old software that hasn't been really updated in I think since, for example, in some case I remember since 2015. So it's a lot of different devices for sure that can be leveraged into sending this type of volumes. And also just to give some ideas about the level of traffic that we are seeing from individual subscribers. So in some cases we see terabytes of data over the course of a week sent purely on DDoS traffic, while the rest of the legitimate traffic is in the order of gigabytes. So it's really quite interesting to see when we look into a bit more details as what is the behaviors of the bots and how does that affect the network congestion, both on the access but also on the international bandwidth.
Thank you. So I guess the first problem that has to be solved is to detect that there is DDoS traffic or botnet DDoS traffic in particular. From our discussions that we had, Craig, I understand that botnet DDoS in particular poses some additional challenges when it comes to detection. So can you give us a little bit of a background? Why is it so hard to detect botnet DDoS as opposed to, say, amplification, reflection, or flooding type of attacks? And also understanding that DDoS attacks are now happening on a daily basis as a constant presence in customer networks. How can we move from the legacy approaches that relied on establishing baseline and comparing, the traffic anomalies. In other words, what is the peacetime, traffic when the DDoS attacks are happening all the time?
Yeah, well, there's several questions there to unpack. I think first, what makes botnet particular is that in the past, a lot of DDoS relied on the ability to detect fake or synthetic traffic. It relied on checks where it was people just spoofing packets as quickly as they could, and you had different types of checks to make sure it was a real OS or a real application at the other end. So most of the last 20 years of DDoS has been based on these aren't real devices, these are not real users, these are a range of other things sending fake traffic. What, of course, is pernicious about botnet DDoS is it is now traffic coming from real devices, from real homes, real businesses. It is traffic that is otherwise has everything correct because it is, I won't say the word legitimate, but it is real traffic from real TCP/IP stacks. And it's also problematic in that you can no longer consider traffic from certain countries or traffic from certain hosting is where DDoS comes from. As we enter this new era of botnet DDoS, it is everywhere. It is in every network in every country of the world. And it is devices that are in some cases gig or 10 gig connected to the internet. So it really is where the devices live, and that you now have devices that look almost exactly like legitimate users sending real web queries, real application queries, real in the sense that they're otherwise indistinguishable in payload, in content from otherwise humans or other services generating the traffic. So really, I think much more challenging to detect, much more challenging to block given the distributed nature. Ultimately, it ends up being a big data problem. I think that the techniques are really different from looking at an individual packet as we did in the past, but doing this type of botnet collection and detection and mitigation requires very large filter capability, such as Nokia as well as other vendors. And it requires really large data analysis to be able to correlate and understand out of these millions of IPs, which ones are real users and which ones are compromised devices. So really significant effort, really change the type of approaches used to detect these botnets.
So you mentioned two aspects that are quite essential for detection of botnet DDoS. I think if I heard you correctly, you have to have a way of figuring out or establishing the prior knowledge of repeat offenders, just to kind of simplify that, or put it in simpler terms. In other words, we need to be able to figure out or track somehow the history of botnet DDoS in order to be able to make better decisions that this is in particular botnet DDoS attack that we are dealing with. And the second aspect that you touched upon is better ways of figuring out what is malicious traffic, what is botnet DDoS traffic. Maybe the use of machine learning and artificial intelligence could come to help along with the big data. Can you just give us a little bit of a background there?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good question. So I've been doing DDoS for 25 years. In the past, we used to look at individual packets and payload and apply ML and feature extraction to individual packets. Botnets really make that approach untenable because there is nothing in the payload. They are legitimate HTTP form posts and otherwise. So instead of operating on individual packets, we do something quite differently. In particular, we are maintaining massive state on every IP, every v4, every active v6 in the internet. We are crawling every IP. We are tracking if that IP has been used in DDoS before. We are tracking the CVE associated with each IP. And really, when you have access to all 4 billion IPs, v4, v6, you can then start to do analysis in real time as you see traffic flows, understanding that these, in fact, are large botnet attacks. So it really is applying ML and AI not to individual packets, but to millions of IPs and millions of different traffic flows and doing it longitudinally, i.e. over time, to understand what IPs are being used together and what types of botnets, where do we think the botnets are being controlled and managed from. But it really is just a big data problem on 4 billion IPs instead of individual packets. And we are extensively using all the latest advances in ML and AI, but over a very different data set than we've used or I've used in other companies over the last 20 years.
Thanks. Let's switch the optics now from to the service providers' perspectives. Jerome, you're closer to your customers in the region, and you discussed these issues with them. Can you give us an idea of what types of considerations do they have on mind when it comes to DDoS? What they are looking for when it comes to an efficient DDoS protection solution?
Right. So I think this is really where, as I mentioned briefly before, the first step is really getting visibility. When we speak to customers, the first thing that they tell us is that they think that they have a problem, but they don't know exactly how big is the problem for DDoS, especially when we talk about the outbound DDoS problem. So visibility is first. And then once we get further into deploying a solution like Deepfield, which is software-based, so they can get instantly visibility on the DDoS traffic, whether it is originating from their subscribers or attacking their subscribers. And once we do that, so of course, the next step will be how do we mitigate? And the key point, I think that is coming again and again, is how do we do that cost effectively? Because we know that DDoS traffic continues to grow. And what we've seen throughout last year is that it is actually in most countries growing faster than the rest of the traffic. So it's something that we need to address in a different way than what's been done traditionally in the past decades. One of the things that we can do, so once we have this visibility and we can start to mitigate, is that like Craig alluded to a bit earlier, so we can start to position filter entries in the routers, and this is becoming, of course, much more feasible now that we have modern routers that can manage thousands of filter entries when we need to. We don't often need so many of them, but it's something that will be quite key in addressing the botnet DDoS problem. And finally, and I think that's the point that we also come back to regularly, it's on the point of, how efficiently can we do that? So not just cost efficiently, but also how effective are we at mitigating and neutralizing the DDoS threat? Because it is easy to mitigate or to block DDoS, but of course the challenge comes from lowering the false positive rate to make sure that we block as much of the malicious traffic, but that we don't block the legitimate traffic in the process.
So thanks, Jerome. That's a very good consideration to have a very efficient mitigation system added to detection, because without mitigation, even the best detection solutions are not really putting that excellence into use. Speaking of excellence, Craig, I would like to go back to you, and you shared with us some of the recent work you and your team and the emergency response team of Deepfield has done investigating a number, I would say thousands of DDoS attacks that happen globally. Can you please share some detail on that work? What does it entail? And what benefits, what are the lessons learned can we draw from them, apart from obviously using that to productize it in the Deepfield portfolio?
Yeah, also a good question. So as mentioned earlier, I think one of the big changes for Nokia Deepfield has been treating DDoS as a big data problem, as opposed, as I mentioned earlier, to looking at individual packets. So we've been spending and investing significantly in tracking basically all major DDoS every day, essentially everywhere in the world, and being able to take snapshots of the DDoS, to understand the components of the DDoS, the botnet, the spoofing, the amplification components, and all using it both to work in real time with our customers to help ensure the reliability and availability of their networks, as well as, of course, using that knowledge and information to continually refine the real-time data feeds used in our product. As Jerome mentioned, to, if we have and when we've got filters available, to be able to leverage the growing capacity of commercial routers, to be able to block these large botnets, as well as other types of DDoS traffic. So we're working quite closely with our customers on a real-time basis on all of these. And also, as I mentioned, we are working closely with the different industry groups, trying to raise the bar, not just for Nokia Deepfield, but for the entire industry. So we are starting to publish and share information and share some of the data. But we certainly believe at this point we've amassed one of the largest real-time collections of DDoS events in the world. And that data on real-time DDoS, particularly when combined with our secure genome, knowledge, and history of every IP in the internet over the last 2-3 years, provides really a formidable, I think, data set to both analyze DDoS trends, as well as to ensure and add technology for the continued availability and quality of experience of networks around the world.
So from your experience, you've looked at thousands and thousands of DDoS attacks and analyzed them with the team. I know that they come in all shapes and forms. Some of them are kind of single vector attacks. Others are more complex. They employ a number of attack vectors happening concurrently or simultaneously. They can also vary in the range of IP addresses from which they are coming from, and number of IP addresses that they are targeting, as well as in volume and packet rate. So can you give us a little bit of kind of explanation or dissection when it comes to all these different forms and types of DDoS attacks that you see? What are we looking for? What are the most dangerous characteristics, say, of a botnet DDoS attack? Is it the sheer volume? Is it the number of IP addresses? And what actually makes some of those attacks to be more difficult to be mitigated or stopped?
Yeah, sure. So I think when we think about DDoS, there's really two ways to think about it. One is the impact, and the other is on the difficulty of mitigation, remediation. In terms of impact, DDoS is all about denying service, and it's going after resource. Typically, the resource is either bandwidth, trying to overwhelm upstream links. It is state on a firewall or a load balancer, where DDoS is trying to overwhelm the amount of state with SYN-ACKs or SYN, because typically when firewalls or load balancers reach state, they either fail open or fail closed. But either way, there is limited state usually on the firewall and load balancer, or the attacks are trying to go after an end resource. This is true of different types of application, HTTP, HTTPS, TLS, DNS attacks. So really one of those three is being targeted, either the bandwidth, intermediate middleware, firewall, load balancers, or end systems, and often used in conjunction with other types of attacks, intrusion attempts, and others. So that's how I think we think about the impact. On the mitigation side, as mentioned earlier, it really is a spectrum. In the previous 20 years, DPI was incredibly effective looking at specific aberrant payload within the forged traffic. This is either within the headers, the payload itself, and basic clustering or ML/AI algorithms were really effective for the sort of earliest generation of DDoS up until just fairly recently. What has changed on the mitigation side, I said, is that these are no longer badly spoofed packets coming from easily identified parts of the world. These are increasingly botnets that are sending massive SYN floods, SYN-ACK, UDP floods, and of course, application botnets. These are IPs that live within every network in the world, with, in fact, many service provider data centers for some of their own servers or their own hosting. And it is, I think, significantly more challenging to mitigate these types of attacks because the earlier techniques of payload and identifying other invariants with ML or AI feature extraction just don't work. So it really is a very different type of problem today. And increasingly, it is the sheer number of IoT devices that are being compromised on an almost daily basis, combined with the growing level of connectivity, bandwidth, reachability to these IoT devices that are proving extremely problematic for many of our customers.
Thanks. Moving to adjacent topic, which is really about contemporary nature of DDoS attacks that we are seeing in the context of the recent and ongoing conflict between Ukraine and Russia. So is there anything interesting when we look at the DDoS attacks in particular, or DDoS activity that was aimed at targets in these countries? Maybe you can just give us some information. What have we seen in the early days of the conflict? What types of targets were targeted by DDoS attacks?
So really interesting, I think, seeing different patterns in the types of attacks as well as in the frequency and distribution of attacks. But again, DDoS is just not a concern for any individual company. The overall concern for DDoS is the overall threat it imposes to global connectivity, not just the sites under attack, but often the collateral damage and other networks in the path of the DDoS, where I think we've got significant concern amongst our customers. And certainly, Jerome has been working closely with many of his customers on the sheer number of IoT botnet devices that have been sort of hijacked into this conflict and are now causing congestion, other problems in Asia, thousands of miles away from the victims of the attack.
Thanks. Jerome, care to comment? You also mentioned to me the emergence of the crowdsourced DDoS as a relatively new phenomenon. Maybe you can just explain a little bit what that is for our audience here.
We have, I think, more recently seen some of what appears at least some tighter coordination between different potential actors, or at least people who are using different botnets. So we've seen in more recent days, for example, larger attacks that are actually using different sets of botnets that are targeting the same concurrent infrastructure. So that's some of the new development, at least, that we have been seeing. I think also worth highlighting is that, so I think you alluded to that a little bit, is when a country in Asia is sending, terabytes of traffic to a government agency, a military or security agency, that can also, of course, trigger some questions afterwards. So of course, it also helps if first you can have visibility and shut down the attack, or at least be aware of what's happening on your network from your subscribers to see if something can be done about it to minimize damage. And I think, of course, to close here, the key point to protect your own infrastructure, because of course today it is it is for one country, but the next it could be for your own. So I think it's also essential to take steps to automate the protection of the network. So it's something that we've of course been working with our customers to not only give them the visibility of what is happening, but how do we automate the response to the attacks. And we've seen, especially in almost any recent major DDoS attacks, but even those that we just talked about, some of them can be very short-lived. So it does require automation. And this is where the, let's say, the interplay between having this type of big data-driven approach together with the routers that can be programmed to insert filter entries dynamically depending on what's happening on the network are essential to really shore up the defenses of your network and to protect your infrastructure and your subscribers.
Thanks. And I'd like to thank both of you for your time here. I think this is quite an interesting topic. We shared our perspectives on botnet DDoS, on the importance of big data, cloud-native approach to detection of botnet DDoS and other type of DDoS. Also, the importance of having a solid mitigation mechanism in using the network as a self-defending mechanism to take care after all of these malicious traffic. We also heard from Craig about Deepfield's extensive research capabilities and the library. We have built more than thousands of DDoS attacks that are analyzed and used to to create optimal mitigation strategies, as also Jerome mentioned, to automate them as much as possible in order to really enable DDoS protection for as many customers as you can possibly have in the network. I would also like to thank our audience for joining us today in this session. We hope you enjoyed it, and I hope also you will join us in the future session on this topic. Please check out the links we will be providing in the chat window that points to our product and portfolio information, to our solution, and we hope to see you in the future. Thank you.